The bells of St. Mary Overy tolled long before the sun rose. It was a cold, damp morning in late October, and the fog that clung to the Thames was so thick that a man could barely see 3 paces ahead. Thomas Ashford woke with a jolt, his body stiff from the cold, his breath forming small clouds in the dark room. He lay on a straw-stuffed mattress on the floor of a cramped chamber above his father's tannery, a building that leaned slightly to one side as though it, too, were exhausted from years of standing in this unforgiving city. The room smelled of damp wood, old straw, and the faint but ever-present odor of animal hides being processed in the workshop below. Thomas was 23 years old. He had broad shoulders shaped by years of hauling heavy skins and stirring vats of solution for his father's trade. His hands were rough, his knuckles scarred, and his dark hair fell just past his ears in the unkempt fashion of a working man who had little time or reason to care about appearance. But behind his tired eyes there lived something that did not belong in a tannery. Ambition. Not the reckless, foolish kind that leads men to gamble their last coin or pick fights with strangers in taverns. No. Thomas carried the quiet, burning kind of ambition that keeps a man awake at night, that makes him practice the same task over and over until his fingers ache, that makes him believe, against all evidence, that the circumstances of his birth do not have to be the circumstances of his death. Today was the day that ambition would be tested. Thomas had been secretly apprenticing under a tailor named Geoffrey Hale for nearly 2 years. Geoffrey was a respected member of the Guild of Merchant Tailors, one of the most powerful craft guilds in London. He had taken Thomas under his wing after seeing the young man's natural skill with a needle and thread, a skill Thomas had first developed mending his own clothes out of necessity, but had refined into something far more deliberate and precise. Geoffrey had submitted a petition on Thomas's behalf to the guild, requesting that Thomas be examined for admission as a journeyman tailor. The examination was set for this morning. Thomas swung his legs over the side of the mattress and placed his feet on the cold wooden planks. He could hear movement below. His mother, Agnes, was already awake, tending the fire and preparing the morning meal. He dressed quickly, pulling on a brown wool tunic that he had sewn himself, a pair of worn hosen, and leather boots that had been patched so many times they were more repair than original material. He splashed cold water on his face from a basin near the window and looked out. Through the warped glass, he could see the dark outline of London Bridge stretching across the Thames. Even at this hour, there were figures moving on it, merchants and laborers beginning their day, their torches flickering like small stars in the fog. The bridge was a marvel and a horror in equal measure. It was lined with shops, houses, and even a chapel, all built so close together that the structure groaned under their weight. At the southern gate, the heads of convicted criminals were displayed on pikes, a grim reminder that the law in medieval London was as brutal as it was absolute. Thomas descended the narrow staircase. The lower floor served as both the family's living space and the entrance to the tannery workshop. The smell was stronger here, sharp and acidic, the kind of smell that settled into your clothes, your hair, your skin, and never truly left. His father, William Ashford, sat on a low bench near the hearth. William was a man of 52, though he looked much older. His back was permanently stooped from decades of bending over tanning vats. His hands were stained a deep reddish brown that no amount of washing could remove. His face was lined with deep grooves, and his eyes held the flat, weary expression of a man who had long ago stopped expecting anything good from the world. William did not look up when Thomas entered. He simply stared at the fire, his jaw set, his hands resting on his knees. Agnes stood near the hearth, stirring a pot of thin pottage made from barley, onions, and a few scraps of salted pork. She was a small woman with gentle features and hair that had gone gray before its time. When she saw Thomas, she offered him a warm but anxious smile. "Sit and eat," she said softly, ladling the pottage into a wooden bowl. Thomas sat across from his father and began to eat. The pottage was bland and watery, but it was warm, and warmth was a luxury in this house. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant toll of bells marking the passage of another hour. Then William spoke. "You are still going." Thomas set down his spoon. "I am." William finally looked at him. His eyes were not angry. They were something worse. They were resigned. The guild does not want men like us, Thomas. You know this. They will look at your hands and smell the tannery on your clothes, and they will see nothing but a laborer pretending to be something he is not. Jeffrey believes in my work, Thomas said evenly. Jeffrey is a kind man, but kindness does not vote in guild councils, William replied. The men who sit in that hall care about lineage, about reputation, about keeping their trade pure. A tanner's son asking to join their ranks is an insult to everything they believe. Thomas felt the familiar heat of frustration rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. Then let them be insulted. I will not spend my life standing over vats of filth because that is what they expect of me. The words hung in the air between them. Agnes looked from one to the other, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. William held his son's gaze for a long moment, then looked away. Go then, he said quietly, but do not come home expecting me to mend what they break. Agnes stepped forward and pressed a small piece of bread into Thomas's hand. She touched his face gently. Whatever happens today, she whispered, you have already shown more courage than most men find in a lifetime. Thomas tucked the bread into his belt, kissed his mother on the cheek, and stepped out into the cold morning. The street outside the tannery was already busy. A cart loaded with barrels of ale rattled past, its wheels cutting deep grooves in the mud. A woman carrying a basket of turnips shouted at a boy who had splashed her skirt. Two men argued loudly outside a blacksmith's forge over the price of a set of horseshoes. The smells of the city hit Thomas in waves as he walked, each street carrying its own distinct odor. Near the tanneries, it was the sharp bite of urine and lime used to cure hides. As he moved north toward the bridge, the smell shifted to fish and river water. Crossing into Cheapside, the wide commercial avenue that served as the beating heart of London's trade, the air carried the warm, yeasty scent of bread from the bakeries, the rich smell of roasting meat from the cookshops, and the earthy fragrance of wool and linen from the drapers' stalls. London in 1390 was a city of approximately 40,000 souls, a number that had been drastically reduced by the waves of pestilence that had swept through Europe over the previous decades. The streets were narrow, the buildings tall and close together, their upper floors jutting out over the lanes below so that in some places the rooftops nearly touched. Sunlight rarely reached the ground in the smaller alleys, and the mud underfoot was a constant companion, a dark, slippery mixture of earth, animal waste, and discarded refuse that clung to everything it touched. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal. We bring history to life every single week, with stories that put you right in the middle of the action. If you want to keep experiencing moments like this, subscribe right now so you do not miss the next journey back in time. Thomas arrived at the Merchant Taylor's Hall on Threadneedle Street just as the bells of St. Paul's Cathedral struck the hour of 8. The hall was an impressive building, far grander than anything Thomas was accustomed to entering. Its facade was built of pale stone, with arched windows and a heavy oak door reinforced with iron studs. Above the entrance, the guild's coat of arms was carved into the stone, a symbol of authority and exclusivity that had stood for generations. Thomas paused at the door. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. He wiped his palms on his tunic, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. The interior of the hall was vast. The ceiling was high and supported by thick wooden beams, and the walls were hung with tapestries depicting scenes of the guild's history. A fire burned in an enormous stone hearth at the far end, casting long, dancing shadows across the flagstone floor. The air inside was warm and carried the faint scent of beeswax candles and polished wood. At the far end of the hall, behind a long table draped with a dark cloth, sat 3 men. These were the guild masters, the senior members responsible for evaluating all petitions for membership. In the center sat Edmund Blackwell, the head guild master, a man in his 60s with a sharp, angular face, gray hair cropped close to his skull, and pale blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore a deep crimson robe trimmed with fur, and his fingers were adorned with rings that caught the candlelight. To his left sat Richard Parr, a heavy-set man with a ruddy complexion and a thick beard. To his right sat Hugh Neville, a thin, quiet man who rarely spoke but whose opinions carried considerable weight. Geoffrey Hale was already in the hall, standing near one of the side walls. He was dressed in his finest tunic, a deep blue garment with neat stitching that advertised his own skill. When he saw Thomas enter, he gave a small, encouraging nod. Thomas walked to the center of the hall. His boots echoed on the stone floor. He felt the eyes of the guild masters on him like a physical weight. A wooden table had been set up in the center of the room. On it lay several lengths of fine wool cloth in different colors, a pair of sharp shears, an assortment of needles, spools of thread, a measuring cord, and a piece of chalk. These were the tools of the trade, and Thomas knew each one intimately. Blackwell studied Thomas for a long, uncomfortable moment before speaking. "You are Thomas Ashford, son of William Ashford, tanner." He said the word tanner the way a man might say a particularly unpleasant disease. Thomas met his gaze steadily. "I am, sir. And you believe you are qualified to join this guild, a guild that has counted among its members some of the finest craftsmen in England." "I believe my work will speak for itself, sir." A faint murmur rippled through the hall. There were perhaps a dozen other guild members present, seated along the walls as observers. Thomas could feel their scrutiny, some curious, some openly hostile. Blackwell leaned back in his chair. "Very well. You will be given a task. You are to construct a fitted garment from the materials before you, a doublet, properly measured, cut, and assembled. You will work under observation, and you will complete the task before the noon bells. If your work meets our standards, your petition will be considered. If it does not, you will leave this hall and not return. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, sir." "Then begin." Thomas stepped to the table. He closed his eyes for just a moment, centering himself. He thought of the hundreds of hours he had spent in Geoffrey's workshop, cutting fabric by candlelight, stitching seams until his fingers bled, unpicking his work and starting over when the result was anything less than perfect. He thought of every sacrifice, every secret evening spent learning a trade that was not supposed to be his. Then he opened his eyes and picked up the shears. He began by selecting the cloth, choosing a deep forest green wool that was tightly woven and of excellent quality. He measured carefully, using the cord and chalk to mark precise lines on the fabric. His cuts were clean and confident, each one deliberate, each one exactly where it needed to be. The room fell silent as he worked. Even Blackwell, who had begun the examination with barely concealed contempt, found himself watching closely. Thomas assembled the pieces with a methodical efficiency that belied his nerves. His stitching was small even, and remarkably consistent. He worked the seams flat, reinforced the stress points, and shaped the garment with a tailor's intuition that could not be faked. Hours passed. The candles burned lower. Thomas did not pause, did not hesitate, did not look up from his work. His world had narrowed to the fabric in his hands, the thread between his fingers, the rhythm of the needle passing through cloth. When the noon bells rang across the city, Thomas stepped back from the table. Before him lay a completed doublet. It was elegant in its simplicity, with clean lines, precise measurements, and stitching so fine it was almost invisible. He had even added a subtle decorative element along the collar, a small flourish that demonstrated not just competence, but artistry. Geoffrey Hale exhaled audibly from his place along the wall. Blackwell rose from his chair and approached the table. He picked up the doublet and turned it slowly in his hands. He examined the exterior, then turned it inside out to inspect the interior seams. He tugged at the stitching, pressed his thumb along the seam lines, held the garment up to the light to check for irregularities. Richard Parr and Hugh Neville joined him. The three men examined the doublet in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Blackwell set the garment down and returned to his seat. His expression was unreadable. "The craftsmanship," Blackwell said carefully, "is of a high standard." Thomas felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. "However," Blackwell continued, and the spark flickered, "this examination is only one part of the process. As you are no doubt aware, there are members of this guild who have expressed serious reservations about your admission. A formal vote will be held this evening among the senior membership. You will be informed of the result before the curfew bell." Thomas nodded. "Thank you, sir." He turned and walked out of the hall with as much composure as he could muster. The moment the heavy oak door closed behind him, he leaned against the cold stone wall and let out a long, shaking breath. Jeffrey caught up with Thomas on Cheapside. The older man was slightly out of breath, his thin frame not built for hurrying through crowded streets. "Thomas, wait." Thomas slowed, but did not stop. Jeffrey fell into step beside him. "That was extraordinary work in there. You know that, do you not?" "It does not matter how extraordinary the work is if they refuse to see past my father's trade," Thomas said, his voice tight with frustration. Jeffrey was quiet for a moment. They walked in silence past a row of goldsmith shops, their windows displaying an array of rings, brooches, and chains that glittered even in the weak autumn light. A street performer juggled wooden clubs near the corner of Poultry Lane, drawing laughter from a small crowd. "I want to tell you something," Jeffrey said at last. "When I was young, before I became a tailor, my father was a chandler. He made candles, not a glamorous trade, not a wealthy one. When I petitioned to join the guild, there were men who looked down on me for it. They questioned whether I had the refinement, the sensibility to work with fine cloth." Thomas looked at him. "What happened?" "I stood in that same hall just as you did today, and I proved them wrong, not with words, with my hands. And slowly, over the years, they forgot where I came from. Or perhaps they did not forget, but it ceased to matter because the quality of my work made the question irrelevant." Jeffrey stopped walking and placed both hands on Thomas's shoulders. "That is what you did today, Thomas. You made the question irrelevant. Now it is up to them to decide whether they are wise enough to see it." Thomas managed a small smile. "And if they are not?" Jeffrey shrugged. "Then they are fools, and history has a way of forgetting fools." They parted ways at the corner of Bread Street. Jeffrey headed back toward his workshop, and Thomas found himself alone in the swirling chaos of midday London. He had hours to wait before the vote, and the waiting was worse than the examination itself. He decided to walk. Movement was better than stillness when the mind was racing. Thomas made his way toward the river. The Thames was the lifeblood of London, a wide gray-brown ribbon of water that carried everything from merchant ships to fishing boats to the occasional floating refuse that no one cared to identify. The wharves along the north bank were packed with activity. Dock workers hauled crates and barrels from vessels that had arrived from ports across Europe. Flemish merchants argued with English customs officials. Fishermen mended their nets while seagulls circled overhead, their sharp cries cutting through the noise. Thomas sat on a low stone wall near Queenhithe Wharf and watched the river for a while. A barge loaded with timber from the forests north of the city drifted past, its crew shouting instructions to one another as they navigated the current. On the far bank, the marshlands of Southwark stretched out in a flat, gray expanse, dotted with the occasional building or windmill. He thought about what his life would look like if the guild rejected him. He would return to the tannery. He would spend his days doing the same work his father had done, and his grandfather before that. He would grow old with stained hands and a stooped back, and the skill he had cultivated so carefully would wither unused, like a plant denied sunlight. The thought was unbearable. He stood and kept walking. He passed through the neighborhood of Vintry, where wine merchants stored their casks in vast cellars beneath their houses. He cut through a narrow lane near Walbrook and emerged near the churchyard of St. Stephen. The city was a labyrinth, a dense web of streets and alleys that seemed to shift and change with every visit, and Thomas navigated it with the instinct of someone who had spent his entire life within its walls. As the afternoon wore on, the sky darkened with heavy clouds. A cold wind blew in from the east, carrying the promise of rain. Thomas pulled his tunic tighter around his shoulders and continued walking, his thoughts a turbulent mix of hope and dread. He found himself in the churchyard of St. Mary Aldermary, a quiet space enclosed by a low stone wall and shaded by a pair of ancient yew trees. He sat on a bench and stared at the ground. For the first time all day, the weight of what he was attempting truly settled on him. He was not just asking for a place in a guild. He was asking for permission to become someone new. He was asking a group of powerful men to look past centuries of tradition and prejudice and see him, not as a tanner's son, but as a craftsman in his own right. And the terrifying truth was that no matter how skilled he was, no matter how perfect his doublet, the decision ultimately rested not on merit, but on the willingness of other men to set aside their biases. That was the cruelest part of it. He could control his own effort, his own preparation, his own courage, but he could not control the hearts of men who had already decided what he was before he ever walked through their door. Now pause for a moment. I want you to drop a comment right now with just one word: deserve. If you believe Thomas deserves his chance, type that word and send it. I want to see how many of you feel it. The rain began just after the hour of 5. It came down in sheets, turning the streets into rivers of mud and sending the last of the vendors scrambling to cover their goods. Thomas took shelter under the overhang of a cook shop on Friday Street. The owner, a stout woman with a flour-dusted apron, offered him a bowl of hot broth for a farthing. He accepted gratefully and stood in the doorway, sipping the broth and watching the rain hammer the cobblestones. A boy appeared at the end of the street, running hard despite the downpour. He was perhaps 12 years old, thin and soaked to the bone. He spotted Thomas and skidded to a stop, breathing heavily. "Are you Thomas Ashford?" the boy gasped. "I am. Master Hale sent me. He says the vote is done. He says you should come to the hall straight away." Thomas set down the bowl, thanked the cookshop woman, and followed the boy into the rain. They ran through the darkening streets, splashing through puddles and dodging the last stragglers heading home before curfew. The torches mounted on building walls hissed and sputtered in the downpour, casting weak, unsteady light across the wet stone. By the time they reached the merchant tailor's hall, Thomas was drenched. The boy pointed at the door, then disappeared back into the rain without another word. Thomas stood before the entrance. Rainwater dripped from his hair and ran down his face. His chest heaved from the run, but it was not exertion that made his heart pound. It was the knowledge that behind this door, his future had already been decided. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The hall was warmer now, the fire in the great hearth built up to a roaring blaze. The candles had been replenished, and their golden light filled the space with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold, wet world outside. The room was full. Every bench along the walls was occupied by guild members, perhaps 40 or 50 men in total, their faces lit by the flickering flames. At the far end, behind the draped table, sat Blackwell, Parr, and Neville. Geoffrey Hale stood to one side, his hands clasped in front of him. His face was pale, and Thomas could not tell whether it was from anxiety or from the cold. Thomas walked to the center of the hall. His wet boots left dark prints on the flagstone floor. He stood tall, his shoulders back, his chin raised, refusing to let the discomfort of his soaked clothes diminish the gravity of the moment. Blackwell rose from his chair. The hall fell silent. "Thomas Ashford," Blackwell began. His voice was measured, deliberate, as though he were choosing each word with great care. "This guild has today considered your petition for admission as a journeyman member. As is our tradition, a vote was conducted among the senior membership to determine whether you meet the standards required of all who bear the name of Merchant Tailor." Blackwell paused. Thomas could hear the rain beating against the windows. "The vote was not unanimous," Blackwell continued. "There were those among us who argued in strong terms that the son of a tanner has no place in this guild. That admitting you would set a precedent that could undermine the standards and reputation we have maintained for generations." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He could see some of the guild members nodding in agreement. "There were others," Blackwell said, his gaze shifting to Geoffrey and then back to Thomas, "who argued that the quality of a man's work is the truest measure of his worth. That this guild was founded not on the privilege of birth, but on the mastery of craft, and that to deny admission to a man whose skill has been demonstrated beyond question would be to betray the very principles upon which this guild stands." The hall was so quiet that Thomas could hear the wax dripping from the candles. Blackwell straightened and spoke with a clarity that carried to every corner of the room. "By a margin of 3 votes, your petition has been approved. Welcome to the Guild of Merchant Tailors, Thomas Ashford." For a moment, Thomas did not move. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended between disbelief and reality. Then Jeffrey let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and crossed the hall to embrace Thomas with a fierceness that nearly knocked him off his feet. "You did it, boy," Jeffrey whispered. "You did it." Thomas felt something break open inside his chest. Not sorrow, not relief, something deeper, something that had been locked away for years, protected behind walls of caution and composure. He felt tears sting his eyes, but he did not let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these men. He shook Jeffrey's hand firmly, then turned to face Blackwell. The head guildmaster regarded him with an expression that had changed since that morning. The contempt was gone. In its place was something harder to define. Perhaps it was the reluctant acknowledgement that comes when a man's assumptions are proven wrong. Thomas left the hall and stepped out into the rain. He did not hurry. He did not run. He walked slowly through the dark, wet streets of London, letting the rain wash over him. The city that had felt so oppressive that morning now seemed different somehow. The same narrow lanes, the same leaning buildings, the same mud and noise and chaos, but seen through different eyes. He crossed London Bridge on foot. The shops were shuttered for the night, and the bridge was nearly deserted. The only sound was the rain and the rush of the Thames below, its dark water surging between the stone piers with a force that made the entire structure tremble. Thomas stopped at the midpoint of the bridge and looked out over the river. To the west, the distant towers of Westminster were barely visible through the rain. To the east, the river curved toward the open sea, toward a world Thomas had never seen and might never see. But that was all right. His world had expanded enough for one day. He continued south, through the gates of Southwark and down the familiar path to the tannery. The building was dark except for a faint glow from the upper window. His mother was still awake. He opened the door quietly. The fire had burned low, but the room was still warm. Agnes sat in her usual chair near the hearth, a piece of mending in her lap. She looked up when Thomas entered, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that only a mother's eyes can hold. Thomas smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and genuine, but it carried the weight of everything he had endured that day. Agnes let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since dawn. She rose from her chair, crossed the room, and wrapped her arms around her son. She did not speak. She did not need to. A sound from the doorway made them both turn. William stood there, leaning against the frame. He had clearly been waiting, though he would never admit it. His face was its usual mask of stone, but his eyes betrayed him. There was something bright in them, something that glistened in the firelight. "Well?" William said, his voice gruff. "They accepted me," Thomas said. William nodded slowly. He pressed his lips together tightly, as though holding back words that were too large for his mouth. Then he walked forward, and for the first time in Thomas's memory, his father placed both hands on his shoulders and held him at arm's length, looking at him not as a boy to be corrected or a laborer to be directed, but as a man. "Your grandfather was a tanner," William said quietly. "His father before him, and his father before that. 4 generations of Ashfords, standing over the same vats, breathing the same foul air, dying with the same stained hands." He paused and swallowed hard. "You have broken that chain, Thomas, and I want you to know, though I am a man who has never been good with words, that I am proud. Prouder than I have ever been of anything in my life." Thomas felt the tears come then, and this time he did not stop them. He embraced his father, and William held him tightly, his rough, stained hands gripping his son's back. Agnes joined them, and the 3 of them stood together in that small, humble room above the tannery, holding each other in silence while the rain fell on London and the fire crackled softly in the hearth. The morning after the vote, Thomas woke early. The rain had stopped, and a pale, cold sunlight crept through the window. He dressed in his best tunic, the green wool one he had made himself, and prepared to walk to Jeffrey's workshop to begin his first official day as a journeyman tailor. Before he left, he paused at the door and looked back at the room where he had grown up. The low ceiling, the straw mattress, the cracks in the walls where the cold crept in. He knew that this room, this life, would always be part of him. but it would no longer define him. He walked through the streets of London with a new sense of purpose. The city was the same as it had always been: chaotic, noisy, filthy, alive. Vendors called out their wares, carts rumbled through the mud, children played in the alleys, and the bells of a dozen churches marked the passage of the hours. But Thomas moved through it all differently now. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer the tanner's son who did not belong. He was Thomas Ashford, journeyman tailor, member of one of the most respected guilds in London, a man who had stood in a hall full of men who wanted him to fail, and had proven, with nothing but his hands and his heart, that he was worthy. Geoffrey was waiting for him at the workshop door with a wide smile and a new pair of shears wrapped in cloth. "A gift," Geoffrey said. "Every journeyman deserves his own tools." Thomas took the shears and held them carefully. They were finely made, with polished handles and a sharp, clean edge. They were the most beautiful things he had ever owned. "Thank you, Geoffrey, for everything." Geoffrey waved his hand dismissively, but his eyes were bright. "Thank yourself, Thomas. I merely opened the door. You are the one who walked through it." Thomas spent the rest of that day working in the workshop, cutting and stitching alongside Geoffrey and 2 other apprentices. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. Every cut, every stitch, every measurement reminded him that this was where he was meant to be. In the weeks and months that followed, Thomas built a reputation that silenced even his harshest critics. His garments were sought after by merchants, minor nobles, and even a few members of the clergy. He never forgot where he came from. He visited his parents every Sunday, and he made sure that the first fine garment he completed as a journeyman was a warm winter cloak for his father, stitched with the finest wool he could afford. The day he presented it to William, the old tanner held the cloak in his stained hands and said nothing for a long time. Then he put it on, fastened the clasp, and walked out into the street wearing it as though it were a suit of armor. The neighbors stared. William Ashford, the tanner, walking down the lane in a cloak fit for a merchant. And Thomas stood in the doorway and watched, and he understood then that this was never just about joining a guild or learning a trade. It was about proving that the circumstances of your birth are not a prison, that the walls others build around you are only as strong as you allow them to be. That somewhere inside every person, no matter how humble their beginnings, there is a skill, a talent, a fire that, if given the chance to burn, can light up an entire life. That is what it meant to experience 24 hours in medieval London. Not the grand spectacle of kings and castles, not the drama of wars and conquests, but the quiet, fierce, extraordinary courage of one ordinary man who refused to accept that his story had already been written. London in 1390 was a place of mud and misery, of rigid rules and cruel hierarchies, but it was also a place where, if you were brave enough and skilled enough and stubborn enough, you could change the course of your life in a single day. And Thomas Ashford did exactly that. If you've watched until this point, it's because you enjoyed this case. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and see who truly enjoys the stories here on the channel. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now. Every week we bring stories that will keep you hooked from the first second to the last. Give this video a like so more people can discover this story, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to change your story. See you in the next video.